Gaudeamus omnes in Domino, diem festum celebrantes, sub honore sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers. I'm Jim Papandrea. This podcast is a production of Catholic Culture. Sign up for our newsletter at catholicculture.org/newsletter. This is the last episode in this interim series on lesser-known fathers. After this, we begin our new year with our new series on the doctors of the Church. But for now, today's episode is on Saint Severinus Boethius. Boethius was certainly not a forgotten father in the Middle Ages. Like Pseudo-Dionysius, he was extremely influential on the medieval scholars. But unlike Pseudo-Dionysius, we actually know who he was, and the Church considers him a saint because, it seems, even though Christianity had been legal for over 200 years, Boethius was martyred for his faith. So why would someone be martyred for being a Christian when Christianity was the official religion of the empire? And how would a person deal with that? Well, it turns out that, in part, Boethius dealt with it by singing. Boethius was born in the year 480 AD in Rome. This is the same year as those wonder twins, Saints Benedict and Scholastica, but I didn't see any sources that would say whether they knew each other. Boethius came from the senatorial class, but the Senate itself had no real power by this time. There were two reasons for this. First, the Emperor Constantine had moved the capital out of Rome. He made his new capital in what he called Nova Roma, or New Rome. Everyone else called it Constantine's City, or Constantinople. But Constantine did not bring the Senate with him, because in those days, the Senate was too conservative. That is, it was too pagan. So the Senate became not much more than a Roman country club. They gave their stamp of approval to whatever the emperors did, sometimes grudgingly, and that's about it. The other reason that the Senate had lost its power is that about 100 years after Constantine, in the 5th century, nomadic tribes from northern and eastern Europe arrived on the scene. Now, these are the ones we often call the barbarians, but that just means that they didn't speak Greek or Latin. And the truth is that their armies were trained by the Roman legions. Many of them had been Roman auxiliaries who once guarded the borders. Well, they moved into southern and western Europe, I suppose for the same reason that people move to Florida now. And in the year 410, they sacked the city of Rome itself. And eventually, by the end of the 5th century, the Roman Empire in the West had fallen and ceased to be Roman per se. And it came to be ruled by the chieftains of the barbarian tribes who ruled Italy as kings. And so, just a few years before Boethius was born, the last Western Roman emperor was politely asked to retire, and the rule shifted to these barbarian kings. Now, the other thing you have to know about this time period is this. Even though the councils of the 4th century, the Council of Nicaea in 325 and the Council of Constantinople in 381, even though they had effectively dealt with the heresy of Arianism, Arianism didn't exactly go away. For one thing, one of the sons of the Emperor Constantine was an Arian, and when he became emperor, he tried to force Arianism on the Western Church. When he couldn't do that, he tried to make Arianism an accepted option. He tried to give the Arians one of the basilicas in Milan, and it was only St. Monica, the mother of St. Augustine, with the help of St. Ambrose of Milan, who stopped him by organizing a sit-in in the basilica to prevent the emperor's soldiers from taking it. But even in the city of Rome, there would be 2 churches with Arian priests and Arian congregations. And at that same time, Arian bishops were able to come back into positions of power in Constantinople, and they sent out the missionaries into the nomadic tribes of northern and eastern Europe and converted them to Arianism. So that when these nomadic tribes, the barbarians, invaded southern and western Europe, they were Arians. And of course, their chieftains were Arians. And these Arian chieftains would become the kings of Italy, and conflict between the Catholics and Arians would continue for a long time. Nevertheless, Boethius himself would become a great philosopher and a politician. In those days, these two things often went together. And Boethius came to be a trusted advisor to the Arian king Theodoric. But Boethius apparently made some enemies, presumably among the Arians at court, and they falsely accused him of treason against the king. According to the tradition, though we wish we had more evidence on this, it seems that there were several among the Senate class accused of treason. I assume this means that the Arians were trying to get rid of all the Catholics. The story goes that Boethius came to the defense of one of his Catholic colleagues, but of course that drew attention to his own Catholic faith, and he was guilty by association and accused of treason as well. King Theodoric apparently believed the charges because Boethius was thrown into prison without a trial, where he languished long enough to write a 5-volume book, and eventually he was executed. And so the church considers him a martyr and a saint, on the assumption that he was executed by an Arian king for being Catholic. He died in about the year 524 in Pavia, Italy, and his feast day is the date of his death, October 23rd. His tomb is in Pavia, in the same church as the great St. Augustine. Boethius's most famous legacy is the book he wrote while in prison in Pavia. This is the 5-volume treatise called The Consolation of Philosophy. It's written as a dialogue between himself and the personification of philosophy. In the dialogue, she talks him down off the ledge of his despair until he can get a grip on his sanity again. Not that he was insane, but he kind of presents it this way. And the point of the whole thing is exactly what the psalmists talk about when they say that you can't put your trust in princes and kings, and sometimes you can't even trust your friends. All that you can trust, all that is immutable, is the truth. The interesting thing, though, is that for a faithful Catholic like Boethius, you would expect him to write about his faith in God. You would expect him to write about his hope in Christ. But that never really enters into the dialogue. And this has led some scholars to question whether he really was a Christian, or whether he really did get in trouble for being a Catholic in an Arian court. But his other documents do show, without a doubt, that he was a man of faith. It's just that with this document, he was writing a work of philosophy, and at that time, you weren't really supposed to mix philosophy with theology. Not that theology was unworthy of philosophy, but that theology was the higher science. In any case, Boethius is an important precursor to those medieval scholastics like St. Anselm of Canterbury, who believed that one could arrive at the important doctrines of theology through the strict study of philosophy alone. That philosophy, as a kind of natural science, would lead you to the supernatural science of theology. So, even though Boethius is writing this in the early 6th century, in the 520s, he is very much a transitional father from the early church to the medieval, especially in his assumption that the study of wisdom, philosophy, will not lead you astray. And the medieval scholars will pick up on this and run with it. In particular, Thomas Aquinas quotes Boethius extensively. Aquinas treats Boethius like a dictionary or glossary of terms. When Aquinas wants to define terms, he often seems to begin with Boethius. In fact, you may be used to the idea that Aquinas gets the way he defines and categorizes things from Aristotle. But until more of the writings of Aristotle were rediscovered in Europe, through the work of Islamic scholars in the 12th century, Boethius's Latin translations of parts of Aristotle were about all the early medieval scholars had of Aristotle. So it seems that in the Middle Ages, everyone read the Consolation of Philosophy, including Dante, who found inspiration in it for material in the Divine Comedy. It's like the Consolation of Philosophy was required reading in higher education, and a bunch of people would write their own books with the same title. Boethius also wrote other treatises, including one on the Trinity. And again, you have to keep in mind that this is precisely the issue of the conflict between Catholics and Arians. Arians don't accept the doctrine of the Trinity or the Nicene Creed. So it's entirely possible that his document on the Trinity contributed to him getting in trouble with the Arians. And we also have 2 letters from Boethius, written to Pope St. John I. He was Bishop of Rome from 523 to 526, but the letters were apparently written before he was Pope, when he was John the Deacon. Also very interesting are Boethius's treatises on math and music, but in these he is still firmly planted in the ancient world. For example, for him, the art of writing and playing music is nothing more than a craft. Of course, you have to remember that most of the musicians he would have heard were probably slaves. And so the very concept of being a performer was looked down upon. Actors in particular were in the same class as prostitutes in ancient Rome, probably because of the way they put their bodies on display on stage and how most female roles were played by men in women's clothing. But the point is that someone like Boethius thought of the performance of music as more of a service to be hired than an art form. For him, the real artists are those who study music theory. And I don't even mean the composers, but the abstract theorists. And this is in part because he thinks of music as audible math. For the ancient philosophers, music and math are so intertwined as to be really just one thing, at least on a cosmic level. So Boethius ends up saying that the person who theorizes but doesn't play is engaging in the more pure art form, and the person who writes and plays the music is not really the artist, but is simply a hired worker. And so you might say that the critics of today who think they know better than the creators of art, well, they're following in the ancient Roman tradition of someone like Boethius. It's only later that the Western world begins to recognize what we would call famous composers and virtuoso performers. Interestingly, though, within the dialogue of the Consolation of Philosophy, there are songs that maybe Boethius sung in prison, or at least that consoled him while he was in prison. So apparently, part of the Consolation of Philosophy was, for Boethius, the consolation of singing these songs. Now, some of the manuscripts of Boethius's book that come from the 9th century and later contain music notation. And so some scholars and musicologists have worked on reconstructing what these songs might have sounded like. And I'll include a link in the description to a video so that you can hear them performing their interpretation of the notation attached to Boethius's songs. But just keep in mind that the music notation was added centuries after Boethius, and so the music notation reflects later medieval music, not the ancient Greco-Roman music of Boethius's time. The question is whether what got written down as music notation in the 9th to the 11th centuries would have any connection to the earlier music, perhaps preserved by an oral or performative tradition. But even in that case, it would still have evolved significantly from Boethius's time. So when you listen to the musicians playing these songs from Boethius, what you're hearing is something much more like later medieval music, rather than something from Boethius's time. So what's the takeaway from this church father whose fame has dwindled since the Middle Ages? Well, my own primary field of study is the early church, what we call patristics. The word patristics comes from the word for fathers, like patriarchs. It's the study of the church fathers. And of course, as you know, there are also some church mothers. But we scholars all overlap with the adjacent time periods. So I work in the New Testament, in the early church, and in the early medieval period, as I like to say, from Jesus to Aquinas. But whenever you talk about these time periods, it begs the question, when does the early church end and the Middle Ages begin? And as we've seen with Pseudo-Dionysius and now with Boethius, it's a blurry line. Somewhere in the 5th to the 8th centuries, we're making the transition from the early church to the medieval church. In Pseudo-Dionysius and in someone like Maximus the Confessor, you have something of the end of the patristic era and the beginnings of medieval mysticism. And again, in Pseudo-Dionysius and now in Boethius, you have something like the end of the patristic era and the beginnings of medieval scholasticism. And what we're seeing here is a return to philosophy that anticipates the medieval scholastics. Or maybe we could go so far as to say that, in a way, these are the first of the medieval scholars, or at least that they are beginning the transition to medieval philosophy. You know, the early apologists, like Justin Martyr and Athenagoras, way back in the 2nd century, they were philosophers. They used the tools of classical philosophy, the logic and the rhetoric, to write apologetics for the Christian faith. Clement of Alexandria said that philosophy can lead the Greek mind to Christ, just like the Old Testament would lead the Hebrew mind to Christ. But then Irenaeus came along, and he said that philosophy only really leads to heresy, specifically Gnosticism. And then Tertullian famously said, "What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem?" In other words, what could philosophy possibly have to do with theology? And so ever since that, there had been a real skepticism of philosophy that lasted for a few centuries. But now here we see when philosophy makes a comeback. And in many ways, these last two of our lesser-known fathers, Pseudo-Dionysius and now Saint Severinus Boethius, set the stage for the scholarship and piety of the Middle Ages, being the roots of both the scholastic branch and the mystical branch of medieval thought. All of which proves that in the Middle Ages, these fathers were anything but forgotten. Next time, on The Way of the Fathers, we'll have an introduction to our new series on the Doctors of the Church. Thanks for listening.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Catholic Culture audiobooks, bringing to life classic Catholic writings. Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. And the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.